Okay, so um, first of all, you know this person, okay? And he is here very much, not only in spirit, but materially as well. As Deirdre will confirm later on, it was Arnie, along with Mary Lee Smart, Louisa Mace Gillespie, Helen Horn, and a few other key people in terms of the culture here of the town that permitted this barn gallery to even exist. And I'm very, I think one of Arnie's greatest prides was his role in the creation and continuation of the barn gallery. He loved the arts almost as much as he loved broadcasting. And for him, Ogunquit was art. It was where he did his art, that's for sure. And he was so close and enamored of what artists could do. And people like Henry Strader, the Betts, Patience Haley, so many other artists that aren't here, Val Toline and whatnot, were they are the people who really made Ogunquit what it is. And for Arnie, it was such a pride that he could take part in that. So I'd like to thank all the people that are here. I'd like to welcome you. And since we are here in the Barn Gallery, especially thank you to Helen, Louisa, Mary Lee Smart, may she rest in peace, and others that were so important in creating this what we enjoy now. My name is Carlos Vega, and I would like to welcome you to this gathering in memory of Arnold William Ginsburg, known to most as Arnie Woo Woo Ginsburg. Arnie passed away on June 26, 2020, about to turn 94 years old, after a life that was magical. Arnie meant a great deal to many people, not only to those of you here, but to many others unable to attend because of the pandemic or for other reasons. And then unfortunately, in many cases, it's because they died before he did. Otherwise, they would certainly be here. Indeed, for generations of New Englanders, Arnie was simply a part of life. Today, we will hear from only a few voices that will remind us of how magnificent and meaningful he was. We meet in sadness, of course. Today would have been his 95th birthday. And we are mourning someone who embodied so much of what is best in humanity and hopefully in us. But perhaps even more, we gather to give thanks for his beautiful life. We gather in gratitude for having been blessed by knowing him and perhaps even sharing part of our own life on this planet with him. For many, what first stands out is Arnie's role in the development of American music, primarily rock and roll. Several leading figures in broadcasting have wished to be here, but the current realities have not made things possible. They have, however, sent us messages that I think are worth listening to because they will increase our appreciation of what Arnie has meant in the realm of American culture and broadcasting and music. The first you will hear from is John Garabedian, a noted broadcasting celebrity known not only for his nationally syndicated programming, but also for public access video music television, especially the former V66, which was a co-venture with Arnie. And one of the things you're gonna hear, and you will hear from other people as well, is that Arnie was able to listen to a good idea and help to make it happen. The second is Ron de la Chiesa. You probably all know who he is from the Boston Symphony Orchestra and other important venues. The third is Harry Sandler, president of the New England Museum of Music. Then Richie Bolspaw, the noted broadcasting entrepreneur who started with Arnie together and for whom Arnie was a mentor and went on to own 13 stations throughout the country in one of the largest conglomerates of radio. And then we will hear from Donna Halper, a noted broadcasting historian and a broadcaster in her own right. And what's particularly moving about her was that she was a woman and was able to get through all these ridiculous expectations we had about deep voices on the air. And she has gone on to do many beautiful things. And throughout the area here, you will see some copies of her book, which is the definitive book on Boston radio. And you know, of course, who's on the title, Arnie, and she will tell us why that is the case. So we're just going to start, if we could, with these videos that have been prepared by them for us today. If you need to, again, go out and get something, or refreshment, libation, please do so. And let's roll. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to speak, and I sincerely regret that I can't be there in person, but I found out 2 weeks ago that my vaccine only gave me about 40% protection because of some medications I was on back in February when I got them. So it's smart not to be in a group at this time. Anyway, but here we are, and it's true I met Arnie when I was 15. It goes back to when I was a freshman at Weston High School, and came in one morning and someone yelled out, "Hey, Arnie Ginsburg mentioned Weston High School on his radio show last night." I said, "Arnie Ginsburg? Who is Arnie Ginsburg?" I couldn't believe somebody would be on the radio with an ethnic name, because everybody with them was Jim Roberts or Bob Smith, or just, you know, lily white waspy names. So that night I tried to listen, and to get Arnie on 1600 WBOS was a challenge because the signal was very poor in the western suburbs. But I listened to the night train show and heard Arnie, and like everybody else, fell in love with the show, which was very entertaining. It wasn't just the music, it was Arnie. And Arnie was sort of like Beyonce. Not that he looked like Beyonce, but she once called herself Sasha Fierce, because off stage, Beyonce is the most laid back, deferential, sweet person you'd ever want to meet. She's lovely. But she gets on stage and she's got her red, you know, fuck me heels on, and away she goes. And Arnie was like that on the air, as we all know. He was fantastic. So about a year or so after that, a friend of mine and I made a record. And we thought, well, what do we do? Let's call Arnie Ginsburg up and see if he'll play it on his show. So we did, and he said, okay. He said, why don't you bring it in tomorrow afternoon, and I'll listen to it, and if it's any good, we'll play it on the show. So we did, and it was amazing to meet him in this dirty WBOS studio on Comm Ave in Boston, right at the Cottage Farm Bridge, right at the corner, right across from Cadillac Olds. And so that night we went on the night train show, and it was thrilling, and everybody in school heard it, and we were big stars. And then the next day he called us up to tell us that he'd gotten a letter from Roulette Records because we used portions of one of their songs, and they were going to claim copyright violation and blah, blah, blah for these two kids from Weston High School. So that was about it, and kept listening to Arnie all the time, and then somehow I met him one night at, this is, I was in my 20s. Of course, I was in radio, so I was always aware of him, and I loved his style because he was so much fun and so funny. Arnie was on WMEX 1510. He'd moved over. Mac Richmond hired him when Joe Smith went off the air and went to New York to be in the record business. And the morning show on WMEX was hosted by a guy named Fenway. So I remember coming down by Boston College, heading home one night, listening to Arnie, and he said, don't forget tomorrow morning to put your radio on 1510 to get your ham and eggs. Fenway's the ham and WME eggs. I almost drove into a tree. I thought that was so clever. And Arnie had this clever sense of humor that we all appreciated and we all loved. He'd find humor in anything. He really did. And he had a great way of looking at things, analyzing things. He was a great engineer. And sometime in the late 60s, I think 1968, Arnie was hired by RKO General to go to work to do the night show on WRKO, which had just changed from being an old line station to being a top 40 station, going up against WMEX and WBZ. And Arnie was hired, and Mac Richmond, of course, was furious. So Mac claimed that he had a contract with Arnie, and the contract said Arnie couldn't work for any competitor for 2 years. J.J. Jeffrey had the same contract mysteriously come up. Make a long story short, Arnie always told me he'd never signed such a contract. But it went to court, and Bill Lender, Mac Richmond's lawyer, convinced the court that it indeed was Arnie's signature on it, even though there were questions about that. So Arnie couldn't be on the air on WRKO anymore. So he went into sales because he had relationships with all the clients and everybody. Oh, it's Arnie Ginsburg. And he became the top billing sales guy at WRKO. After that, somehow Arnie and I became friends, which I was thrilled. And he said, well, I don't need this record collection anymore. So he gave me his entire collection of 45 RPM records from 1958 to 1968, which I still have, which probably has a ton of very valuable stuff in it now, because vinyl's had a comeback. Jumping through the years, I'm trying to think of other events and things that happened. I'd see Arnie at, dinners they'd have for artists or shows. And we became friends. And then around 1970, 72, I put a radio station on the air on Nantucket Island. And Nantucket has a bunch of old people, just like most of Cape Cod. And I thought, what are we going to do for programming? So we put on this format that came in by satellite called Stardust. Arnie had been very successful with WXKS AM with the Music of Your Life format, which he put on and did extremely well for a station that wasn't on the air at night, didn't come on in the morning until 7 o'clock, and went off the air at sunset, which is 4:15 in December. But the station did great in the ratings because it had a very loyal audience in the Medford, Malden, Everett area, which had a lot of Italian people who loved that old ballad music, Perry Como and Frank Sinatra and so forth and so on. So I said, Arnie, would you listen to this Stardust format? So he did. He said, there's something wrong with it. And then he finally figured it out. And he called me up one day, I've been thinking about that, which is the way Arnie was. He'd take a problem and go in the back of his mind. He'd think about it every so, then he'd come up with a solution. And he said, they don't play enough ballads. Music of Your Life is about romantic music, not about just old music. And he nailed it. And that was the issue. What's another Arnie story? Oh, so I guess before this happened, he called me up and told me he was hired as general manager of WBCN by B. Mitchell Hastings, who was the owner of the station, which was really a strange thing to put together someone like Arnie, who was logical and practical with an engineering mind, with a bunch of, constantly stoned hippies who were, protesting everything. And culturally, it was oil and water. And that didn't work out, but it next went out that Arnie was hired to become the general manager of a little station in Medford called WHIL, which stood for Hilda, which was the name of the wife of the guy who gave the owner of the station the money to buy it. So W Hilda was an AM station at 1430, which ended up becoming WXKS AM. And they had an FM station, and the FM station was on a 100-foot antenna in Medford. You could get it for about 8 miles. It didn't cover anything. It was at 107.9. The main thing they used it for was covering Malden, Everett, Medford basketball and football games, and they could use that for the night games because W. Hilda had to go off the air at sunset. And that was going along for a little while, and Arnie came up with this idea of changing the format to beautiful music. WJIB had become the beautiful music breakthrough FM station in Boston. Arnie secured a lease to move the FM tower from this little 100-foot stick in Medford up on top of the Prudential. And he was the first one to do such a thing and got a nice lease, long-term lease for no money, and locked it in, which later, when it came time to renew it, it went like 10 times because Arnie done such a good job saving the money for W. Hilda. And he called me up and he said that they've come up with a new name for the station. I said, oh, what is it? Well, I can't tell you, but I'll let you know next week. So he calls me up. We're announcing it tomorrow. I said, what is it? WWEL. Well. And I couldn't understand why that was good. But anyway, WWEL ended up becoming WXKS when Richie Balsbaugh and Cecil Heftel entered the picture. And as Richie Balsbaugh has said many times, he was a young guy coming in with his first job as a general manager. And he needed somebody seasoned who knew the ropes, who knew the market, who knew how these things operate to become his right-hand man, which Arnie was perfect for. And so that went on for years. And then I had meanwhile acquired or applied for and gotten a television license for a UHF TV station, which I had no idea what we were going to put on it for programming or how we were going to pay for it, but we had the license, which had some value. And one thing led to another, and it was time to build the TV station or we were going to lose the license. So I thought to myself, where am I going to get the money to do this? And you have to raise the money, blah, blah, blah. So I called up Arnie, and I'm talking to Arnie. I said, well, Arnie, if you'd help me out with this, I'd really appreciate it. And I'll cut you into the ownership of it, for your contribution. He said, oh, great. Well, it started becoming more than just a little bit of advice here and there. So Arnie, after I asked him if he'd asked Richie if he could take some time off working at Pyramid Broadcasting, and if he'd come over and work with me on building this thing, which he was excited about because it was something new. And Arnie was always stimulated by new stuff. He loved the challenge, he loved the excitement and the showbiz aspect. So Richie gave him a blessing, and Arnie and I became business partners at B66. And you can see the whole story of that by watching the documentary called The Life on the V. And it's on most of the channels. I think it's on Netflix, it's on YouTube, it's on here and there. And if you haven't seen it, Arnie's great in it. He really is. And we made Arnie kind of the centerpiece. One example of what Arnie's contribution was in his practical matter, that was at a time, we raised the money to build the station. We raised $10 million, which today isn't a lot of money, but back then was. And the Boston area only had 30% cable penetration. So 70% of the people were only watching over the air. And we had the most powerful signal of any Boston television station. We were 3.5 million watts. So we had great coverage. But Arnie, who of course spent most of his time in Ogunquit, Maine, where you watch cable because there's no good, strong signals except the Portland stations, which are okay. He said to me one day, he said, we've got to get on cable. He said, it's a major priority. I said, why? He said, because if you have cable and you're not on the cable, you don't exist. And I thought, that's a powerful statement. And it's true, because if you have a cable box on your TV set, you don't even know about the over-the-air station. So Arnie took it as his project to go to the cable operators and get us on cable stations. Well, just imagine how that went when Woo Ginsburg calls you up. He wants to come in and visit with you. Oh, yeah, Arnie, come on in. Everybody loved Arnie. So Arnie was not only instrumental in getting us on every single cable network, all the ones, Time Warner and what became Comcast and Cox in Rhode Island. But he got us great positions on the dial. I think in the Medford, Malden, Everett, Time Warner system, we were on channel 6, perfect. In Rhode Island, we were on channel 3. I mean, great positions. And it was only because of Arnie and his charm and his recognition that happened. And of course, you go into meetings in New York when we were meeting on Wall Street with investors and, oh, woo Ginsburg. Yeah, I went to college in Boston. I loved Arnie. So that's my career path with Arnie. I could go on and on. I think all of us have our own little stories about Arnie and his wit, his intelligence, his kindness. He was one of the most wonderful people that you could ever know. Everything he did was the right thing. He never knew evil or doing the wrong thing. He was always kind. He tried to do things that made sense for everyone. And I will always remember him as a vital part of my life and career as well. My final honor was being best man at Arnie's wedding to Carlos at the Wellesley Town Hall, which I have video of, which is very nice and very moving. And Arnie was so lucky to find Carlos, and Carlos was lucky to find Arnie. And Carlos' devotion to Arnie in Arnie's final years, when he really was not able to do a lot for himself, but keeping Arnie entertained, keeping him vital, taking him places and trips, and just enriched his life beyond what most people could ever hope for. So thank you, Carlos, for what you've done for Arnie. And thanks to all of us for the blessing we have for knowing Arnie.
Well, I'm Ron Delachiesa, and I owe my radio career to Arnie Ginsburg. It started a long time ago in 1958, when I was going to Boston University. And a gentleman walked into the studio. I could see him behind glass because I was on the air, and he looked a lot like Clark Kent. He had horn-rimmed glasses, and he came around and talked to me, and he said, "How would you like to work at WBOS, an AM radio station?" I said, "I'd be thrilled." And he said, "Well, I have a part-time job opening. I'd like you to do it. I like your voice." So I came up and visited him in his studio. He was not too far from BU at the time, and climbed the stairs. And Arnie greeted me, brought me into the little tiny studio where WBOS was broadcasting, and said, "You're going to be the co-host of our ethnic radio programs." So I realized I wasn't going to have my own show, but I was going to introduce and co-host shows like the Greek Hour, the Italian Hour, the Polish Hour, and the Irish Hour. Meanwhile, Arnie was fiddling around the station, and I didn't see him go on the air at all. And that happened a bit later when he started his own show and became a radio sensation. Let me say this about Arnie. You probably don't know this, but Arnie also was the engineer that broadcast the daily, I should say, rosary from Cardinal Cushing's home in Brighton. One time I went out to visit Cardinal Cushing with a tape recorder. We were going to record him to ask about his trip to Ireland. And the first thing he said to me was, "Do you know Woo Ginsburg?" And I said, "Yes, he hired me." He says, "Well, I couldn't do the rosary without Woo Ginsburg. Give him my best." Little known fact about Arnie. Another thing, Arnie was an incredible engineer. Sometimes I'd be in the studio on the radio, and Arnie would be fiddling with all kinds of things underneath the console, around the console, fiddling with all kinds of wires. He was a mechanical wizard. And then he became one of the true giants of radio. You know, I've often said on the Mount Rushmore of radio, that's where Arnie should be, because what a sound, what a style he had. He fit the times to perfection. He had a voice that was so unusual. When you heard Arnie on the air, you wanted to hear him talk all night because he had these whistles and horns and things. He made radio fun, and he had a great fun doing it. And so many young people at the time got into good R&B music because of Arnie. He played the best. I remember watching Arnie audition for his show once with different 45 records, the records that had the big hole in the middle. And there was Arnie listening to these records and just throwing them off one by one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until he got the right one. And he just had an ear for his audience. He knew what they wanted to hear, and he presented it in such a remarkable way. If you listen to those tapes of Arnie Ginsburg, he really knew what he's doing, and he became the icon that he was. So what a treat it is to participate in this 1950 memorial birthday celebration to the great Arnie Woo Woo Ginsburg. And Arnie, I owe it all to you. Thank you for starting my career in radio those 63 years ago and enabling me to do something I know and I love and that I treasure. Happy birthday, Arnie Ginsburg. Everybody loves you.
Said, my name is Harry Sandler, and I'm the president of the Music Museum of New England. I've known Arnie for such a very, very, very long time. When I was a young man, long before there were cell phones and Spotify, there were 45 RPM records. And Arnie was a visionary. Arnie knew we were coming out of the Frank Sinatra years. We were coming out of the Elvis Presley years. And there was a new demographic that was fast rising, the baby boomers. And the baby boomers were looking to have their world the same way their parents did. And so Arnie was wise enough to find a venue or a number of venues such as high schools, colleges, church basements were wonderful. CYOs, the Catholic Youth Organization, would put on record hops, and there would be 45s being spun all night long. The audience had never really seen anything like this because it was a young generation just coming into their own. Arnie was also wise enough to bring in bands, local bands, many local bands, musicians that were just starting out, 18 years, 19 years of age, first guitar, first set of drums. And there was an audience. There's Arnie playing these records on not only the radio, but right in front of them where they can dance, where they can mingle, where they can get to know their peer group in a rather informal setting. The audiences flipped out of over those bands, over Arnie playing them with all of his whistles and bells. Not only did the audience flip out over the bands, but the bands flipped out over the audiences. Attention, acknowledgement. Oh my God, somebody loves me standing up here singing and doing my thing. So as time went on, the effect of the bands was transformational on the audience. That was their first taste of live music. And that audience really impacted so many of those musicians that were just starting. Now, many of those musicians, they liked the attention. Everybody likes attention. Everybody likes acknowledgement. And those musicians, they looked around and said, this is good. I'm having fun. They decide it's not something that's temporary, and they go on. Arnie was so important in starting so many careers. Arnie was so important to give so many musicians from that time frame a venue to express themselves, a forum to get to build up their own confidence and self-esteem, certainly unknown to them at that time. But as you look back, so many of those people, you had to learn how to do that somewhere. My sadness is that many of those venues don't exist any longer. I don't know that they do. High school mixers, college mixers, CYOs, even armories. Armories don't even exist. This is after World War II. So Arnie was so important, giving a large group of people a beginning. And as the president of the Music Museum of New England, I see so many of the bands that we have included, so many of the musicians, the business people, the DJs, Where did they start? They started back there in the early 1950s for this demographic. And they have gone on. I could name dozens of New England musicians and media people that have gone on to be world renowned. And it all started with Arnie. If it wasn't for Arnie, who knows? Who knows where they would be? Those record hops like that. Arnie put his stamp on it with his whistles and his bells, and he put his stamp on all of those musicians that have gone on to be world famous artists. So on behalf of all of those artists that don't play any longer, but started then, and all the ones that have gone on and started with Arnie, I want to thank Arnie for the impact that he had on all of our lives. Thanks so much, Arnie. Happy birthday, 95. Wow.
Hi, everybody. I'm Richie Balsba, and I'm very sorry I can't be in attendance today. But I wanted to pass along a short video about Arnie and about my many memories and many times with him. I'd like to start with just a quick story. I met Arnie in 1978 when I first did a pass-through of WWL as I was the new general manager and we were buying a station. And as I did the walkthrough, I went to the back of the old cinder block WWL building, and there was a door and it opened and there was this guy sitting in this like cinder block office. I looked and it was Arnie Ginsburg. I was like freaked out. He was an idol to me. I didn't really know him, but I knew everything about him. And I was told that Arnie just had an office there. He wasn't really working for the radio station. He wasn't getting paid. So I snuck back into the office and said, Arnie, can I talk to you after we're finished with this? And he said, sure. So after we finished the tour of the building and meeting everybody, I grabbed Arnie and got together with him. I said, Arnie, would you come and work with me? And he was kind of awed by it. I don't think he knew what was going on. I said, let me tell you what we're going to do. So we had a little meeting. I told him that we're going to change the radio station from beautiful music to disco. And I had Sonny Joe White, this young program director from WWL, aboard. And I said, I'd like you to be my operations manager. I'm 29 years old. This is my first job as a general manager. I'm going to need a little bit of tutoring or tutelage. And Arnie jumped at the opportunity, and we became a really great team. Arnie, Sonny Joe White, and I. The greatest thing, well, one of the great things, Arnie found the call letters WXKS. We named it KISS. And we had one argument at the beginning, or one disagreement. I said, we're going to call it KISS 108. And he said, you can't. He said, FM signals are all on the odd number. It's 1079. I said, yeah. What's after 1079? Nothing. I said, we're going to call it KISS 108. Well, he, in very short time, he loved that idea. And Arnie became very open-minded to a lot of crazy things. But I can really honestly say that KISS would not have been anywhere near as successful as it was, or successful at all if it weren't for Arnie Ginsburg. He taught me a lot. He mentored me. He was a great friend, probably the greatest radio personality in Boston. I mean, after all, he was a general manager, an owner, an on-air personality, a program director, a sales manager. He did it all, and he imparted that knowledge to me. Arnie, I had a lot of great years with you, 1978 to 1996, and you lived a long, really successful life. I miss you, and I hope everybody there has a lot of toast to you. You're one in a million. Thanks, Ben.
So this man changed my life. Arnie Ginsburg was my cultural hero. I loved Arnie. I had never met him, but I loved him. I was a lonely kid growing up in Roslindale, Massachusetts. I was pretty much the only Jew in my neighborhood. I was probably one of the only feminists in my neighborhood. That was not a thing in the 50s, okay? I mean, yes, there were some women who thought that they might like careers and stuff. Most of us were stuck in a very conservative time. where there were a lot of rules and you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. And I wanted to be on the radio. And I was told I couldn't be on the radio. And I was told that you had to have a deep voice to be on the radio. Arnie didn't have a deep voice. Arnie was Arnie. He had fun. He enjoyed himself. He was entertaining. He was real. And like I said, I loved him. I loved him for the fact that he didn't change his name. It was an era where if you were on the radio, you had to be like Bob Smith, Jim Jones. That wasn't Arnie either. And my motto became, if Arnie can do it, I can do it. Because Arnie was real. Arnie was himself. Arnie was entertaining. Arnie made my childhood better. I know that sounds like hyperbole. He made your childhood better. Yes, he did. Because when I was feeling lonely, when people mocked me, when people made fun of me, I would come home, I would listen to Arnie. He played the songs I loved, but I mainly loved his personality. And he made me feel better. And I made a promise as a kid that if I could ever meet him, if I ever succeeded and I could ever meet him, I would let him know that he had really helped me get through. And I did become reasonably successful. I've written a bunch of books. I was on the radio for a number of years. But the happiest day of my life, as far as my radio career, was meeting Arnie, finally, in 2004. And I bowed before him, and I told him how important he had been to me all my life, what a role model he had been, and how I admired him as a personality DJ, something that I still think is an important thing in radio. And I promised him that if I ever wrote a book, which I was working on, that I would put him on the cover. And I did. And it's my honor to thank Arnie even now, because I am fully certain that I would not have had my radio career if I did not have a role model like Arnie.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on a little bit to the portion called Family. I think you have a little program, which again can be adapted. And I would like to invite, let's go by seniority. I guess is that Jane or Billy or Paul or who follows? They're the Ginsburgs, the Charicks, the Hilsons. Oh gosh, all kinds of people you have. So I would like to introduce Paul Ginsburg, who was Arnie's oldest nephew. So Paul.
He also left out best looking. I've been asked to speak on behalf of my brother and sister, and just a couple of things. Growing up, we had two uncles. One was named Sumner, one was named Arnie. One had hair, one didn't. Outside of that, you couldn't tell them apart. Until in the early 60s, we moved to a town called Sharon, Massachusetts. And my mother invited the whole family over for Rosh Hashanah dinner. And we had only moved into this house a few months prior and did not have any drapes up in the living room. And our living room faced out to the street with a huge picture window. And as we were sitting down to eat, somebody looked out the window and went, "What is that?" Every teenager within 3 blocks was standing on our front lawn. Arnie had to get up, go out, introduce himself, sign autographs, shake everyone's hand before we could go to dinner. Which was the first time I realized he wasn't like my other uncle. He was somebody important. At that time, I thought, well, maybe Johnny Most was important, or Kurt Gowdy, because they're the only people I knew on the radio that announced the Celtics games and the Red Sox games. I didn't know what rock and roll was. Until a few years later, when I became a teenager, and boy, did things change. And all I can say is that my uncle took care of me as a teenager better than any teenager could ever ask for. I saw the Rolling Stones. I saw the Beach Boys. You name it, I saw it, and with pretty good seats, and free too. The other thing that that I remember him for, and that my brother and sister remember for, is his house up here in Ogunquit. Our family has been coming up here for over 100 years. Arnie's house in the Cove was first rented, I believe, by Jane's mother. And then Arnie bought it. And it's always been one of my favorite places, as well as my brothers and sisters. And everyone here in the first row is our family. We've got people here from England. I'm from California. And it's to the legacy of my uncle that we would all travel this far to remember him. And I just want to thank you all for coming, and also Carlos for everything that you've done, putting this all together and taking care of my uncle for all those years. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Paul Takeuchi. I'm from the Japanese Jewish side of the family, which is quite small. I'm the oldest of my generation on the Hilson side. There's 4 of us, me, my brother Mark, my cousins Michael and Jay. Since I was the oldest on my side, I probably had the most time with Arnie. And I just wanted to say a few words about Arnie's his magnetic personality. I think everyone knows, what it was like to be with Arnie. I think there was something truly special about him. He's incredibly kind, compassionate. He always made you feel special, And my primary experience of Arnie was through my grandmother, Betty Ross, who was also a big Barnes supporter. And I came up summers and spent a week or two up here on Israel Heads Road. And Arnie and my grandmother were cousins and very, very close. Arnie used to come up, when I came up, I wanted to see my grandmother, but I really wanted to see Arnie. He was so damn cool. I loved his house. He had Rolling Stone magazine. He had copies of Playboy. And anyway, he would show up on his, he had a moped, a Motobacan early on, and then I think he had various Japanese makes of scooters. He always liked to impress me with his knowledge of Sony products because I was Japanese Jewish. He was a big tech guy. My grandmother and Arnie had a wonderful relationship. They could say anything, dirty jokes, anything. It was truly beautiful, and I really just was so excited to be in that glow of that. And the last thing I'll say is I came up here when my grandmother got, when she was sick and less well. I came up here a bunch on my own, and Arnie, I stayed in her house, and Arnie would always take me out to dinner. We spent a lot of time together during those last couple of years of my grandmother's life, and he had introduced me to his crowd, and I met all the artists behind the houses and everything, and it was very warm and welcoming. I didn't know this side of Arnie's life, et cetera. And we would go to Billy's, we would go to Orweed's, we would go everywhere, and I was so much enthralled with his celebrity presence. It was exciting for me, but there would always be people that would yell out, "Hey Ard, you got a face for radio," and he would always take that in stride. The last thing I'll say is that about his magnetic personality is everyone knows how you felt when you were with him. It was just extraordinary, just the compassion coming out of him. And you really felt special, right? He was warm, loving, empathetic. And I feel like he's kind of a Buddha soul. There are very few people like that in the world. And he really had an impact on that positivity and that really warm vibe. So it was an honor to be related to him, to know him. And I am so grateful to Carlos for everything. And I'm glad that they found each other. And it's been such a beautiful experience to have Ogunquit enriched with all his orbit and everything. So we miss you, Arnie.
It's wonderful to see so many faces that I haven't seen for so long, and I know a lot of people feel that way too. It's scary times. I have a few thoughts and a few thoughts from some other people that I'm going to share. As Carlos said, I'm Deirdre O'Flaherty. I'm president of Ogunquit Arts Collaborative, which at one point was Barn Gallery Associates. We're the nonprofit arm of the building, which is a building. But I like to think of it as an artist clubhouse too. And from what I've heard, it sounds like it kind of was Arnie's clubhouse. And it was great to see him here so often. I first met Arnie in person at a Barn Gallery reception in the early 70s. Yes, that was the last century. But really, had met him years earlier in my teens, listening to WMEX. I grew up in the Boston area. And the Night Train show. While singing along and dancing too, we were much less inhibited back then when you were in your own home, dancing to the now classic oldies, listening to the classic oldies during the decades after, I was brought back to junior high and high school days, the dances, personalities from the hip and cool music world, and the Night Train marker, the train whistle. I can't believe I found it. Arnie's show was a soundtrack for all the busy teenage years. When I met Arnie in Ogunquit, I couldn't wait to tell my mother. She would ask me continually to turn my radio down. Simpler times. Arnie certainly was a celebrity to those of us who tuned in each night, but in Ogunquit, he was real. He's a real person. And as a bonus, he was tremendously supportive of the arts. When I first became involved with Barn Gallery, Arnie was very active in Barn Gallery Associates, the BGA, the nonprofit part of the gallery. To secure the signage that the barn needed from the town, Arnie went to bat and helped make it happen. The mellifluous voice that could soothe anyone's hard edges. Some of my favorite memories were the birthday parties he feted in early August. There was a sense of mischievous camaraderie that flowed over all and played out like a true artist's ball. And there would be themes and much picture taking. Often themes were suggested, characters from the sea, and come as your favorite painting or painter. It was an opportunity to see how creative and occasionally naughty people could be. A clothesline was hung, and a painted sheet provided a backdrop for photographic portraits, a kind of pageant of the masters, Perkins Cove style. It was swell. A kind of adult prom without a grand march and without chaperones. Arnie continued to support Barn Gallery after his time with the BGA and continued to be a presence at many artistic events in the town. He and Carlos, excuse me, he and Carlos would arrive at our summer Ogunquit Art Association Barn Gallery receptions, and it was a highlight of the evening. I, as many others, will miss him and his Cheshire cat smile. Woo-hoo, woo-woo. And then from Nancy Davison, who is a past president of the Ogunquit Arts Collaborative and also a member of the Ogunquit Art Association, Ogunquit Art Association, as I am, remembers too the whole sign thing that came down. This is Nancy, Arnie was Barn Gallery's greatest supporter. He showed up for everything, and often riding his little scooter. He came to events held by Barn Gallery Associates, the Ogunquit Art Association, and the Ogunquit Arts Collaborative, the successor to the BGA. I didn't know him well, but we spent hours one year looking for pictorial evidence that our signage, our signs, definitely predated Ogunquit sign ordinance. And we found those images in scrapbooks of newspaper clippings, press releases, and old photos. I learned a lot of Ogunquit folklore. I'm not from around here, and Arnie proved his point. And then from a longtime friend who was not able to be here, she's 91, just a youngster compared to Arnie. Arnie was my first Ogunquit celebrity. He would arrive from the city Friday evenings as we were ending our days as waitstaff at Renee's, Surf Room, Valerie's, or Bessie's. Some of us were in college working for tuition. Others were locals who knew everyone. And Arnie was our celebrity. 3 of us lived in Joel Perkins' barn with horse stables on the ground floor. Steep steps were attached to the outside for our entrance. Dick Perkins had invited me to join Shirley Lindquist and him in sharing the rent. Miles from town where we all worked, I signed on for the summer. Arnie's Fridays and Saturdays were his, and his Sunday afternoons were often ours, with lobsters, corn on the cob, jugs of third rail, and jazz, true jazz. We sat on the uncarpeted floor listening to Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, Syrian Suicide Song, Nellie Lucher's Lake Charles Boogie, and the sax of Arnie's cousin, Sergei, I think it was, Shaloff. Humor flowed, opinions aired, lobsters eaten as Arnie reviewed his week away. Our Ogunquit salon, my late adolescent self, named these moments. Politicians, sports figures, radio personalities were in Arnie's orbit out there, and here in Ogunquit, we had the man himself, Arnie Woo-Woo Ginsburg. And Maureen says, I loved his looks, I loved his voice, and I loved it when he called me Mo. And this is from Maureen Conlon Pierce, a longtime friend of Ogunquit Arts. Okay.
Hi, I'm Laura Jacques. I've known Arnie a long time, and I'm going to kind of bring in some of the memories of people who are not here. I'm not going to mention everyone, but there's a lot of friends from Arnie that have passed, and I feel they're here. To have known Arnie is to love and remember him always. For all who shared his life experience and friendship, he was a positive force of intelligence, style, and humor who inspired our best selves. Many people who loved Arnie are here today. We are blessed with our woo-woo stories and memories. In my tribute, I'll speak about Arnie's friends who are no longer here in body, yet still lively in spirit. And they may be here with Arnie and us now. First, a sketch of how I met Arnie. In 1972, I arrived in Ogunquit at age 14 with my cousin Larry Miller, who knew him in Boston in the swinging 60s. With his partner, Bob Beardsley, Larry took my family to dinner at Poor Richard's, the hot spot at the corner of Pine Hill and Shore Roads. We were waiting for a table when Arnie walked in, and within a few minutes, I was at the bar with him where he offered me a glass of wine. I disclosed my underage and that I could have a Shirley Temple. He told the bartender to give her a Shirley Synagogue. On that vacation, Arnie took me to Barnacle Billy's for a lobster roll and the first of many ice creams he would indulge me in over our 40 years of friendship. Arnie loved Barnacle Billy's and the Tower family, and their Swiss chocolate ice cream was his favorite. I'm sure some people know that. When I moved to Boston in 1978, Arnie hired me to be Miss Kiss and taught me how to be a spokesperson for the new radio station he was promoting, Kiss 108. To dress the part, he took me shopping at Louis on Boylston Street and bought me a bright red chiffon one-shouldered disco dress, which went to the York thrift shop, and I saw somebody buy it for her prom at York High School. It was fabulous. We shared a passion for fashion. Arnie was an innovator and professional in every way, a real star who recognized the talents shining in others, as rock and roll history tells us. At 21, I moved to New York City and remained close to Arnie during summers and holidays in Ogunquit with Larry. When I moved to Maine in 1995, we became neighbors in Perkins Cove by the Little Josias River until he passed last year. I remember some of Arnie's closest friends who predeceased him. They were strong and memorable souls who brought creativity and light to our Ogunquit community. Among them, my cousin Larry Miller was the hostess with the mostest of many parties at his infamous house on Shore Road. Larry was larger than life and literally and figuratively, and known for his brilliant wit and talents in the kitchen. He envied and enjoyed Arnie for being much funnier and faster at jokes. In later days, Larry worried he was still riding his moped, which Arnie corrected him, saying it was his gonad and he was going places. Their banter and ability to outpun each other was epic and hilarious. Just before Larry died in 2018, Arnie was one of the last friends to visit with him in assisted living. Along with a few scratch-off tickets, he would bring Larry crullers and coffee with extra heavy cream from Dunkin' Donuts, which had to be hidden from the nurse because he was supposed to be on a diabetic diet. Bruce Thayer was Arnie's very dear friend and like a younger brother. They played together in the day in Boston and were neighbors in Perkins Cove. With Arnie's urging in the early 70s, Bruce bought his charming red cottage next to the late Ellie Todd, right in front of Perkins Cove, is a place we all spent a lot of time there. Bruce was a gentleman and patron of the arts and artists, and a gracious host of some of the most memorable parties in Ogunquit. Bruce passed too soon in 2010, and the last thing he said to me was, "Take care of Arnie," though really, he took care of me. For decades, they shared newspapers and stories on weekend mornings. I'm sure some of you saw that. And no one laughed louder at Arnie's jokes than Bruce. Paul Hagen, you gotta feel him in the room, was Arnie's most enduring Ogunquit pal. The story of how Paul met Arnie at an ice house party in Perkins Cove in the early 60s is classic. Paul had moved to Ogunquit from Key West to open a pottery shop in the Cove, and I believe it was one of the first pottery shops in Perkins Cove. At the party, Paul wanted to meet new people and thought Arnie looked like the coolest guy there, and of course he was. Paul offered him a joint. When Arnie said he never used dope, Paul was shocked and impressed by how perfectly high and mellow he was naturally. Paul he never had met anyone so cerebral with such celebrity, and it's so true. It's like Arnie was always cool and always the same and always up and always happy, and again, is something I think will stay with us. When Paul's health suffered in later years, every afternoon I watched Arnie walk up to Paul's house on Ledge Road and bring him a chocolate bar that they would share on Paul's porch while they argued and complained about everything. Paul Hagen passed away just a few weeks before Bruce Thayer, and I know how sad that time was for Arnie. For as much as he was a public person, he was very private about his emotions. It was a time when we often cried together. For Arnie's 80th birthday, his partner, Carlos Vega, made a wonderful video of the event with many of the old-timers giving tributes. In this video, Arnie's star quality and fluid style as an interviewer and storyteller are in full voice. I recommend anyone who loves local history to watch this video on YouTube, and thank you to Carlos for making that beautiful thing, beautiful memory. In it, you'll see his oldest friends from Ogunquit, and in it, you'll see his oldest friend from Ogunquit, who's still one of the oldest people here, from his friend in Ogunquit and the Boston radio days, Mike Horn. So Mike is still among the living friends. So if you are curious about those ice house parties, call Mike, because he's still got stories to tell, I'm sure. Arnie enjoyed hanging out and arguing with Mike, right, a lot, and was close to his wife, Helen, and their children, Whit and Cole, and they're here today. In a precious moment At his 80th birthday party, Isabel Luando described Arnie. Isabel was a lovely artist, muse, and conservation activist who made the Ogunquit scene. She literally made it. She really brought something to our community that we still have, but we don't have in person anymore. She was an influencer who created and documented much of the art and nature in our community and inspired others to step up and take action. Arnie was a big fan of Isabel, as we all were. In the video, Isabel remarks that people remember how important Arnie was in their lives and how old they were and where they were and what they were doing when they first heard him on the radio and connected to his program. I think that's the essence. She caught the essence of Arnie and how he was a positive force who impacted our creativity and love of music. She passed away in 2011, and the town of Ogunquit dedicated the Isabel Luando Estuary in her honor at the footbridge, which I went to that with him and Arnie. We were there together. Went to a lot of memorials with Arnie, including Susan Lefferts and a few others here that are not here. Of all the souls celebrating today, alive here and lively on the other side, the most loyal and perhaps most loved by Arnie is his dog, Pinion, the best Chihuahua ever, a small guy with the biggest personality and bark. I'm sure Arnie is feeding him little ham morsels with the loving hand that petted and adored him. The Cove misses seeing Arnie walk with Pinion and how he would kindly take time to say hello to everyone who recognized him. Woo-Woo liked being asked for his autograph. He really liked being famous, and he was such an impeccable star, really. Arnie knew me the best, the longest, like many people here. And like many of us, he gave me confidence in my creativity and encouraged being practical but passionate about my dreams. We had all kinds of adventures. Some wild ones he told me not to tell Carlos. Arnie was a father figure in my life for 5 decades. I am grateful to have known and loved him. He is deeply missed. When grieving, our sensory memory is a conduit to feel close to the people we've lost. When I recall the sound of Arnie's voice in my mental radio, I feel his love and my heart smiles. Thank you.
Whoa. Arnie was literally an icon in the radio and music industry. I don't think there was anything quite like him. With his whistles and train sounds, he may have been Woo-Woo Ginsburg to his following, but he will always be Uncle Arnie to us, and a gentleman and a friend. My introduction to Arnie was through Mike in the 50s when we lived in the ice house in Perkins Cove. And he stayed a few shacks away from us with John Todd during the summer season. That was almost 7 decades ago. The ice house was renowned for its parties, and often when our local pickup band was finished playing, Arnie would arrive around midnight after DJing at a local hop in Hampton, New Hampshire, or Old Orchard Beach. And he'd bring back whatever band was there, and they would play, and the ice house would rock till 4 or 5 in the morning when the local fishermen would drop by for a drink on their way to work. Mike and I married and built a summer home and enjoyed the ritual of kicking off the weekends every Friday night with Arnie at our dinner table, catching up with the week's events, and where I was the target of their relentless Polish jokes and their crazy humor. Arnie oversaw the arrival of our two sons and enjoyed the role of an unofficial godfather to them, never forgetting a holiday, birthday, or graduation. He was their Uncle Arnie and always will be. Arnie was a great supporter of the arts in Ogunquit, particularly through the Barn Gallery, where he played many roles, including president. I became president after him for the next 15 or 20 years and always relied on his support and advice. I shall never forget one early winter night when he drove me from Massachusetts to the Portland, Maine Museum of Art. When the museum board and supporters were gathered and I officially presented our Barn Gallery's Hamilton Easter Field collection to their quite overwhelmed board, Arnie and I reluctantly parted with it, both of us feeling it should have gone to the OMAA. But that's another story. However, its loss made a big impact upon us. Arnie was always generous with his time and money to the art community, and it should be recognized. Then Carlos came into his life. Carlos filled a void we never knew existed. It was wonderful to hear Arnie's glowing reports of their travels and adventures abroad, and his pride in Carlos's accomplishments, and his newfound companion, his dog, Pignon. We shall always be thankful to Carlos for his care and devotion and providing Arnie a quality and dignity of life right to the very end. I have to quote William Butler Yeats, one of my favorite poets, when he said, "The glory was I had such friends." Thank you.
I wasn't planning on this, but I felt inspired to talk about Arnie and tell you how much my family loved him. I was in the 8th grade, and Arnie loved this story, by the way. I went to Mary Barn, and I was in a jitterbug contest. This is up in Booth Bay. And I won the contest, and Arnie came over and gave me my prize, and I got to talk to him. Of course, I lived in Groton, Massachusetts, and we all knew about Woo Woo and the adventure car hop and Saugus. I'm in my 32 coupe listening to the radio, and I couldn't believe that I had met him. And then in the early 60s, I married Bobby Brazier, and I moved to Perkins Cove next to Mike and Helen Horns around the corner, and Becky and David Lenny. And the first year, I came to the Cove in 64, and I lived on a little boat in the Cove with Robin Richards was next door to me. And I met up with Arnie again. I had no idea that he lived in Ogunquit, Maine. And then I decided to have a surprise birthday party for my husband. And Arnie was the first person on my list. Of course, my husband wasn't really happy about the surprise birthday, but that's okay. And then, of course, for years, well, actually, I always had, Helen Horn had one too, always had a scooter, because I lived in Bermuda at one time, and it was like second nature, and Arnie had his scooter. And then these people said to me, "Oh, well, the Hell Angels are in town, and they're going to go have the blessing of the Harleys." So I saw Arnie at the post office, and I said, "Arnie, we've got to go." And they had a priest there. I said, "Well, I'm not Catholic, and you aren't either, but let's go." So we took our little scooters down, and we had the blessing of the scooters, and that was just so much fun. And also, every time I saw Arnie in the Cove, when we would hug, I always remembered his beautiful shirts. He had the most beautiful shirts. He was such a great dresser. And also, you know what? He made life fun. He was so much fun, and he always had this positive attitude about everyone. And then I did a small little video of him at his house by the river. And what I did, I was very naughty. I had him take his scooter, and the cameraman and I followed him down, and he was so playful and childlike that he actually took a left-hand turn and went right into the ice house. And there were people in there buying gifts. But I just My husband and I, Bobby, and my mother-in-law, Muriel, we just adored Arnie, and he brought so much joy into our lives. And he is a really good example about loving one another and being playful and actually being childlike, and you don't ever have to grow up. And he was a remarkable, remarkable person, and we loved him dearly. So.
Thank you, Marcia. If anyone else would like to speak, oh, someone is coming. Okay.
I guess a lot of people know me here from the Sandpiper, from all the years I was there. Arnie and June prior, we painted that Sandpiper fuchsia before we opened. And June's daughter is here, says she still has the jeans with the paint on them, same color paint. And between Mike Horn and Arnie, got me a job at Columbia Records in Boston. So I used to have dinner a lot with Arnie, and we used to go to some pretty rough places occasionally. But whenever they knew him, changed the whole place. One night, I picked him up for dinner, and he said, I'm a little rushed, but read the news. So I read the news with a very heavy Irish brogue. And the next day, he said to me, you know, they called up and they want an Irish or an English, someone to read the news after that. But he used to bring people on the boat. I ran a charter boat here in the Cove for many years. And he brought Andy Warhol one time. He would bring Al Cap. He brought me the guy one time that robbed the Gardner Museum. And but he was a friend of everybody. I mean, he knew everyone, whether they were on this side or that side of the law, I guess. But I used to go to him to hops. I'd drive him sometimes. Well, we just had great times. And he'd come to the Sandpiper, and I could go on and on and on, but you know, I sound like an advertisement, but he was the greatest guy. Sorry to see him go. Thank you.
As unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, I couldn't get away tonight without upping my wife for a second. She did such a good job, I think I'd add something to it. There might be a question in your minds about how Arnie, as a person, got into the society, as it would be, of Ogunquit. And he met a fella by the name of John Todd, Ellie Todd's husband. They had a bookstore in Perkins Cove, and Arnie started to come up there. And he and John Todd, he was married to Ellie, had this bookstore down as you go around the bend in the Cove. And it got to be a social center, as it would be. And he and John Todd rented a house down up on the upper part of Furwick Road, a real rundown shack that was made of orange crates. And those two guys lived there. Well, it did happen, and this is how I'm getting to my point, that my dad, and that was the year I graduated from college, my dad had a house, my folks had a house right across the meadow from where Arnie and John Todd, rented the other house. Well, when the word got out that Arnie Ginsburg was living there, all hell broke loose at night. Girls, guys, everybody running through the woods, drinking outside, and it got to be the point where my father got a little upset. And I said, "What's the matter, Dad?" And he said, "You know, there's people that are raising hell over there. There's this nice, quiet, few cottages here." He says, I don't mind the noise. I don't mind the people running through the bushes. I don't mind the drinking and falling out in the street. But when those people start pissing on my petunias, I'm really..." and that's a true story. And I think that was he and John had a couple of other places, but I think that was, in a way, his introduction in 1949 or 50 to Ogunquit. And well, he had a family here, and he'd been here since he was 2 years old. But as far as the society goes, that's it. Thank you.
What do you want to be most remembered for?
I never thought of that. I really don't know. What do I want to be most remembered?
What are you most proud of?
Well, I guess the thing that I enjoyed most was, as a broadcaster, disc jockey, whatever you want to call it, was making other people feel good. That was my project, my mission, and also satisfying myself in being in the radio industry. I enjoyed all phases of broadcasting, including the electronics of it as a child and an adult, and the concept of communications, and rock and roll music, which I discovered in around 1956 when I went on the air as a disc jockey, as a joke, and got more and more involved in rock and roll, and found out I really loved it and enjoyed it, and I'd like to see other people who enjoyed it, and the changes and the social changes that went along over the years. And the music is a never-ending journey, and I like being part of the so-called rock and roll era.
So what would you want written on your tombstone?
My favorite tombstone is in Key West, Florida, and it says on the tombstone, "I told you I was sick."
Yes. Well, there's also supposed to be some of those elsewhere as well, but yes. Yes. Seriously, what would you want to have written? Do you want it to say Arnold W. Ginsburg, Arnie Woo Woo Ginsburg? What would you want to, what would you want it to say?
I never thought of that because I'm being charbroiled when I die, so I will be in, yes, I'm being cremated.
Okay.
Or maybe I'll be pureed, I'm
All
not
right,
sure.
you'll be pureed, okay. But so what does one do with the ashes then?
With the ashes, I think they should be spread around this area of Maine where I am right now. And that's it. The matter of cremation is...
Okay, so I'll get back to my question. What would you want on your blog?
On my blog? Arnie Ginsburg, a good guy, helped pioneer rock and roll, and always fascinated with broadcasting radio, communications.
That's all?
if you're stating something about the person, but
So what is happiness for Arnie?
well, interesting question, because most of the time I'm not unhappy. I don't experience unhappiness for long periods. So I don't know. I think that I think I'm in control of my life for my purposes, not my purposes, but for my personality. And it's very important. One reason is I just recover quickly, I hope. I'm just that kind of person. I'm not a long-term griever. I feel that life is really wonderful, and I might feel differently if I weren't healthy or generally healthy and so forth. But I think I have a fair attitude from my person. Everybody has a different attitude. But for myself, I think I enjoy life and enjoy people, and maybe I've just been very lucky or very dumb. But I've seen people destroy their lives because of their negativity. I think I recover fairly quickly, which is important. As long as you're on this planet, enjoy it, be positive. Salute. More questions?
No. Any more answers?
No, either I'm fooling myself, but I really have enjoyed life and feel comfortable from my own viewpoint with the life that I've had. The life that I have. Bye-bye. Oh, yes. one thing, I have a sense of humor, sometimes a strange sense of humor, but I always like to share it with people if it makes them smile or picks them up. But I think it's important, extremely important. It takes you through, helps you through life. That's all, folks. If you're waiting for coronary, you'll have to wait at least 4 more hours to a meeting. And thanks for the memories.
Again, thank you all. And there's more food, whatever, and thank you. And Arnie would be quite happy that you came. Thank you.
Hi, Carlos and all. I'm very sorry I can't be with you to remember and celebrate Arnie today. I'm David O'Leary. I worked with Arnie at V66 in the early 80s and then at KISS 108 after that. I also worked with Arnie at WBOS when it was 92.9 WBOS. I was there in the 90s. I didn't work with Arnie at WBOS, but when I did work with Arnie later on, he was always fond of reminding me that he worked at the real WBOS, 1600 AM, many years earlier. I will add to what many have said already about Arnie being such a joy to know and to work with. While he was, of course, a legitimate legend, icon, I never knew him to be somebody who would throw his weight around. The idea of Arnie Ginsburg saying, "Don't you know who I am?" is, I mean, just try to imagine that. It's hilarious. During the V66 years, whenever there were appearances, the VJ, I was a VJ at V66, and whenever there were live in-person appearances, the VJs would be kind of a big deal, always, except when Arnie was around. And then it was always, "There's Arnie Ginsburg, that's woo-woo, did you know that?" In recent years, it was a real pleasure, although it was rare, it was a real treat to spend social time with Arnie and Carlos, either up in Maine or at events close to home. Arnie was gracious and kind and thoughtful and was an intuitively brilliant broadcaster. And it really was a pleasure to work with him. Radio, TV, doesn't matter. He was just brilliant at it. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be kind of part of this celebration and be included in it. It was a thrill to work with Arnie and to get to know him personally, and he will be missed.